Now, the interesting thing is, and we've said it's pretty unlikely, it had gone wrong in the Philippines, and MacArthur is actually either killed or thrown off the beach. You know, it's a major reputational hit for him. He's recovered from one before, of course, by having all his planes hit in the Philippines the day after Pearl Harbor. But, you know, that would be very difficult to walk away from.
You know, the pilot says, I've just seen the biggest battleship I've ever seen in my life, and nobody believes this guy. And so Sprague tells him to turn around, and I want you to go back and confirm this thing.
The number of aircraft the Japanese lost just flying them out to islands. They'd fly out to nowhere. Now,
great point.
Yeah, the Japanese lost nearly 40% of their aircraft, actually just getting lost in the Pacific.
The Philippine Sea, a vast expanse of water in the Pacific Ocean, played host to one of the most decisive naval battles of the Second World War, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. In October 1944, this monumental clash became the largest naval battle in history, involving over 300 warships and hundreds of thousands of personnel from both the Allied and Japanese forces. It marked a turning point in the Pacific theatre, as Allied forces aimed to liberate the Philippines and sever Japan's critical supply lines. Japanese naval strategy was desperate and bold, designed to inflict maximum damage and potentially reverse the tide of the war. But despite fierce resistance, the Allies achieved a decisive victory, paving the way for Japan's ultimate defeat. This battle was a testament to the power, strategy, and sacrifice that defined the Pacific War. I'm James Hanson, this is Times Radio History, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every week we focus on a different battle or military campaign, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today it's the Battle of Leyte Gulf, one of the largest naval battles in history, which marked the effective end of the Japanese fleet as a major offensive force. But what if the tides were turned and it was the Japanese who had successfully executed their complex battle plan, delivering a decisive blow to the Allied fleet? Well, that's a question for our experts, and joining me today, as ever, is the historian and author Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and returning to the channel is World War II scholar and author Jonathan Parshall. Welcome to you both. Now, what we have in front of us here is our big map of the Pacific theatre as it would have been in 1944. A few things to note, first of all. The Philippines themselves, where, of course, the Battle of Leyte Gulf takes place, highlighted on the map now, and the sort of the Gulf of Leyte is around about there. Then you've got Japan, of course, and, of course, at this stage of the war, the Japanese fleet is severely diminished, but it's just about hanging on. It's seeking one final decisive strike back against the Allies. And the reason the Philippines are so important is because of where they are located. They're right in the middle of the supply lines between Japan and Indonesia, where you've crucially got the oil supply that keeps the Japanese empire running. Dr. Chris Parry, let's start with you. Give us a bit of context as to where we are. This is 1944, October 1944, but less than 6 months of the war in Europe to run, less than a year of the war in the Pacific to run. The Japanese are down, they're not quite out. How down are they?
Well, what's happened is, from the Battle of Midway onwards, the Americans and their allies, the Australians and New Zealanders, have fought their way across the Pacific in two axes, basically. The US Navy and US Marine Corps have led the way across the Central Pacific. They've gone through all the islands. They've either captured them or they've island hopped. They've just left unimportant islands behind, and the Japanese there have been stranded and they're starving. Meanwhile, Douglas MacArthur has been working his way up from the Solomons after Guadalcanal up towards Papua New Guinea. And about the same time, they're fighting up through here and being very successful as well. So you've got this twin axis attack that is going through. All the time, American industry is producing vast amounts of war material, particularly in the case of the Pacific, new fast carriers, which have very large air groups, and also fast battleships as well. Totally replacing the sort of fleet that we saw at Pearl Harbor. And there's a debate about where they want to go next. And the debate essentially is, we're just about to take the Marianas Islands. That's significant because once the Marianas are taken, you can actually fly B-29 bombers directly to Japan and bomb Japan. And so they say, What are we going to do after that? And there's a debate. The Navy lobby wants to go and capture Formosa, wants to bypass the Philippines in a very big island hopping exercise. Yeah. That leaves their flank quite exposed. There's a lot of aircraft that Japanese have got in the Philippines, and the bulk of their fleet is back in Brunei where the oil is. And so they've got to watch out for this flank if they're going to do that. But that's what Admiral King and Nimitz want to do. They want to go to Formosa.
Formosa being modern-day Taiwan.
Taiwan. Now, Douglas MacArthur, of course, when he was ejected or volunteered to be ejected from the Philippines when it was captured, said, "I will return." And he's determined to return. And some people in the press are very snidey and saying, well, actually, he's got quite a lot of financial interests there, so he wants to go back there pretty quickly. But MacArthur's whole reputation is built on, I will return to the Philippines. And, you know, an indication of that is ahead of this campaign, there are a lot of leaflet drops and buttonhole drops with Douglas MacArthur's head on saying, I will return. And so you can see what's going on here. The other issue throughout the summer of 44 is that President Roosevelt thinks MacArthur might be the Republican candidate
for November's election.
Yeah. So he's extremely concerned about his political profile and the fact that he'll come back rather like Caesar or Pompey into the political space, and of course be a real problem for him in November if he's successful. There's a famous debate between Nimitz, MacArthur and Roosevelt about whether it should be Formosa or it should be the Philippines. Now, most historians think it was agreed in advance between Roosevelt and MacArthur that it would be the Philippines. And the deal was, you won't run against me in November, will you? But there's a debate. And in the end...
The scholarship is divided. Is open on that one. But yeah, you know, I do think you're right. To add some additional nuance to that, I mean, the card that MacArthur ends up playing with the president is a moral one, to say that, you know, the Philippines were our holding. The Philippine people are looking to us as their liberators, and it would be morally reprehensible for us to bypass them and leave them there. They are, in essence, American subjects. Mm. And, you know, where you come down on that from a military utility standpoint is one thing, but that card ends up being successful. The other thing is that the Formosa operation had a lot of logistical difficulties, and there were a lot of people on Admiral King's staff, who was Nimitz's boss, including Admiral Spruance, who were coming to King and just saying, man, we don't want to go to Formosa. This is going to be a big pain. There's very large Japanese forces there. The logistics are going to be a nightmare. Let's not do it. And so the end result of this whole debate ends up being that, yes, we're going to go and try to liberate the Philippines after we get done capturing the Marianas Islands in June, July.
And John, just give us a sense, if you can, of the strength, or more to the point, the weakness of the Japanese fleet at this point, post the Battle of the Philippine Sea. I mean, their carriers have got what, like 100 aircraft between them?
Yeah. I mean, one of the salient points of this battle that we're going to be talking about, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, is that the Americans come into this battle with more fleet destroyers than the Japanese come in with carrier aircraft. So the Japanese carrier force has been absolutely gutted in the Battle of Philippine Sea, and they just haven't had enough time to reconstitute that fleet. Frankly, they haven't got enough fuel oil at this point to run all of those carriers, even if they could build new ones, nor do they necessarily have the aviation gasoline to train new carrier aviators to put on them. And so the carrier force at this point is in the hurting locker. The card that the Japanese had left to play is their heavy units. They still have 9 battleships at their disposal. They have 14 or so heavy cruisers. The majority of those, as Chris said, are down south near Singapore, where the oil supplies are. So they're going to have to bring the heavy units up from the south. They're going to have to bring the carriers down from the north. And so they come up with this immensely complex battle plan to have 3 or 4 different formations of warships all converge on the Philippines and then try to converge on the American landing spaces from both directions.
This is a pre-planned operation, though. There's a number of these Shogo plans, depending on what the Americans are going to do. So it's already in place. It's not in response to what the Americans might do. It's one of several plans.
It's a contingency plan they've had for a while.
Yeah, so there was one for Formosa, for example, another one for down in the Dutch East Indies. So it's been in the locker.
And we've mentioned the Battle of the Philippine Sea a couple of times. I mean, we should just very briefly, Chris Parry, talk to us about what happened there and the significance of it, because, of course, that is really important context for what happens at Leyte Gulf.
Certainly. As the Americans approach, the Fifth Fleet, under Ray Spruance, essentially is seeking out the Japanese carrier force. And he wants to hold them at distance if he can, because he's not sure where they are. The Americans want to take Saipan. And while they're engaged in Saipan, what Spruance is really worried about is the Japanese ambushing him and actually getting him caught close inshore. So he holds off, and Admiral Misha, who's his carrier aviator specialist, is furious about this. He wants to go after the carriers. And in fact, the Japanese turn up. They fly nearly 800 sorties against the Americans. They lose nearly 600 aircraft. Some in the direct attacks that they undertake, but mostly because towards the end of the battle, Admiral Spruance allows Admiral Misha off the leash to go after the Japanese carriers. And just as it's getting dark, they launch these raids. They sink 3 carriers. And all in all, as I said, they destroy nearly 600 aircraft and their crews. It's known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. These aviators have to come back at night, in the dark, long distance. Some of them ditch. And to the Americans' credit, they actually put their searchlights on vertically to show where the carriers are in the middle of a combat zone. The submarines come to the surface to try and rescue the aircrew. They do lose some, but at the end of the day, it's a smashing victory for the Americans. And Admiral Spruance has been cautious. He's kept his main fleet back. He's let Misha go and sort things out with the aviators. And the brown shoes are happy.
Well, let's zoom in now. That set the scene really nicely. Let's zoom in now and focus on the Battle of Leyte Gulf itself. Hello, Times Radio history fans. Thanks so much for watching, and sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to tell you about a brilliant new channel we're launching about the greatest band in history. And I need your help. Unbeatled with Donnie Campbell is a new show where every week we go deep on one Beatles song. A historian talks us through all the details before a musician unpicks the lyrics and the music behind hits such as Here Comes the Sun, Penny Lane and Come Together. So please, please me and subscribe, like and comment to Unbeatled with Donnie Campbell on YouTube. If you like history and you like your music, trust me, you're going to love this. Now, back to Times Radio history. OK, so we've got another map in front of us now showing the routes of the Japanese fleet and the zones in which they engaged during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. But before we get into that, let's just have a look at some of the key statistics. Now, the US had built up a formidable naval presence by this stage of the war. During the battle, the Allies fielded over 3,000 vessels and 1,500 aircraft. They suffered losses including 3 aircraft carriers, 3 destroyers, and approximately 1,500 personnel. On the Japanese side, they deployed around 67 warships and 300 aircraft, and their losses were far more significant, with 1 fleet carrier, 3 light carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers sunk. The Japanese also suffered over 12,000 casualties. The fierce engagements included the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, the Battle of the Surigao Strait, the Battle of Cape Engano, and the Battle of Samar, which collectively sealed the fate of the Japanese fleet. So, John, to bring you in on this, talk to me about what the Japanese have planned on Operation Shogo, because as Chris mentioned earlier, this is a contingency plan they've had in place for a while. So what are they aiming to do here?
Right. The basic game plan is that they want to crush the beachhead and wipe out the invasion force if they possibly can do so. And they've got, unfortunately, forces kind of spread all over the Pacific to do that with. So, as we have already mentioned, the heavy units, the battleships, and the majority of the cruisers are down near Singapore where the oil is. And so they're going to put that force together under a guy named Kurita, and he's going to come up towards the Philippines, and he's actually going to loop around to the north, go through a strait called San Bernardino, and come down on the invasion beaches from the north. Meanwhile, up in Japan, there is a carrier force that is going to come down from the north that hopefully will draw the Allies out of position so that Kurita, when he comes through San Bernardino, will, go up against no opposition if at all possible. And finally, there's another battleship force under a guy named Nishimura. This has got two of the oldest battleships in the inventory. They are going to come down from Japan and loop around from the south and come up through another strait called Surigao to come against the landing beaches from the south. So you've got the classic pincer maneuver with heavy surface forces, Kurita from the north, Nishimura from the south, and then the carriers sort of acting as bait.
And Chris Parry, talk to us about the American command structure, because it was pretty disjointed. And we're going to talk about, names like Kinkaid and Halsey and MacArthur, but it was an issue for them, this command structure.
Yes, this comes out of the bifurcated way in which they've come across the Pacific. And what has happened is that Douglas MacArthur, all the way through, has been wanting naval forces to be under his command. And this has been resisted throughout by Admiral King, the Chief of Naval Operations, and by CINCPAC, Admiral Nimitz. And quite rightly, too, because MacArthur has shown a tendency when he's been given naval forces to use them and abuse them as well. And Nimitz is concerned about getting them back again afterwards. So what happens here is the main landing here is commanded by MacArthur himself, and he's supported by an admiral called Kinkaid, and he has a substantial number of forces. He's got initially five old battleships, ones that had survived in the end, Pearl Harbor, by either being raised or actually being repaired again. He's also got three small task forces of light escort carriers, and they're designed to provide fighter ground attack and also anti-submarine work. They're light carriers, and they're known as TAFIs, and they'll play a part later. And they have screening destroyers as well. But they each carry about 30 aircraft, and they're designed to support the land forces. Now, the key thing here is that Kinkaid is working for MacArthur. He's not working for Nimitz, although they're reading each other's signal traffic. Now, the whole landing is being covered by Halsey with the Third Fleet, and that also has the fast carriers amongst them. There are four carrier groups under Admirals McCain, Bogan, Sherman and Davison. And both Kinkaid and Halsey don't think the Japanese are going to attack. And so what Halsey does, he sends two of his carrier groups off to Ulithi back here. See how far away it is?
Yeah.
Okay, for rest and recuperation and repair and storage. So they're on their way. McCain's is the furthest away. Davison is closer in. So he's got two of his carrier groups there. And what have they got? So one has got three carriers and two light carriers, and the other one has got two big carriers and two light ones. So he's got about half his strength there in those terms. He's also got some battleships, some cruisers, and the usual destroyer screen as well. But he's there to cover it. Trouble is, he's working for Nimitz. And so all the signal traffic has come through. The other thing is that he's there to cover the landings, but Nimitz says to him, if you get a chance of a crack at the Japanese fleet, then have a go. And remember, we have to remember one thing about Halsey. Halsey was going to command at Midway, but because he was struck down beforehand by a very, very advanced skin complaint, the command was given to Spruance. So Halsey has spent the whole of the war since Midway looking for Japanese carriers.
Well, John, let's bring you in now, because if you wanted to break down the Battle of Leyte Gulf into phases, you would probably start with the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea. So talk us through what happens there.
Sure. So Kurita's force, which is the big battleship heavy force, and which contains the two largest battleships on the planet, the Yamato and Musashi. And I should preface this by saying that Kurita's had a very rough trip to this point. He gets ambushed off of Palawan by two American submarines, the Darter and the Dace. They sink two heavy cruisers, Maya and Otago, and that's one of those is his flagship. And so Kurita ends up in the water. He's swimming for an hour before he actually gets plucked out and put on board the battleship Yamato. So anyway, this force has had a rough trip. They get up to San Bernardino Strait, and they are set upon by Halsey's carrier aircraft by, in total, more than 250 American sorties that day. And the end result is that the force is beaten up fairly badly, particularly the super battleship Musashi, which is sunk in the course of those attacks. And Kurita then turns his force around and starts to retreat. And the Americans, in the middle of all the other stuff that is going on, are aware of the fact that he has turned around. And that word comes to Halsey, along with some rather over-optimistic reports from the American aviators that they had done greater damage to Kurita than, in fact, had been done. And the result is that Halsey thinks Kurita is retreating.
And then, Chris, I suppose the next thing we should mention is at this point, then Halsey starts heading north.
Yes, so while the landings are going on and this has taken place, and the Americans think they've turned back Kurita's centre force, which is still very substantial. I mean, you've still got Yamato and 5 other battleships, and there are heavy cruisers in amongst them as well. They're in here, and they're keeping surveillance over them, but the communications aren't that great. Davison has come back closer in, so he's now got 3 carrier groups to be able to deploy. And about 16:30 in the afternoon of the 24th, a reconnaissance plane picks up Ozawa's carrier force up here. And he's been desperately trying to attract attention, and nobody's noticed him. He's been doing rectangles.
Noticed,
and Ozawa's thinking, when are the Americans going to notice me? And of course, as soon as Admiral Halsey hears about this carrier force to the north, they start heading north at speed. And he takes five carriers with him. He takes half a dozen light carriers, 6 fast battleships, heavy cruisers. Almost everything goes north with him. And so, you know, you're leaving the San Bernardino Strait absolutely naked. And during that night, Halsey himself is quite ill. He's got flu, and nobody wants to disturb him. And a number of the carrier aviators come back to their carriers and say to their task force commanders, look, we've seen the navigation lights going on in the San Bernardino Strait. We think they're coming back this way.
They've turned around.
And Halsey's staff say, we're not going to disturb the old man. We've got that information. Even Admiral Mitcher is shaken. And Mitcher's not entirely, on the same page as Halsey in temperamental terms. Doesn't like Halsey's staff. There's a real sort of friction between Mitcher and Halsey's staff. And he says, look, if Halsey's got the information, I'm not going to disturb him. So this huge force continues north. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Philippines, you've got another force of Japanese battleships and cruisers coming up. So you've got Admiral Nishimura, who's got 2 battleships, old ones, a heavy cruiser and some destroyers. And behind him, you've got another chap called Admiral Shima, who's got 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and 4 destroyers. Now, the key thing is they hate each other. They absolutely loathe each other. So this is not made for cooperation. Now, the Americans get to detect this coming through. And what happens is that Admiral Oldendorf, with 5 of his battleships and another one, the Mississippi, that joins them, form a battle line able to cross the T. This is the classic naval maneuver where you can line up and actually take ships coming at you in column in the flank. But he also sets up nearly 28 destroyers here and 39 fast torpedo boats. So they have to run the gauntlet of this American sort of firepower. And the bottom line is Nishimura is totally destroyed. He himself goes down in his flagship. And Admiral Shima says, you know what? I know what's going on here. It's a trap. I don't think I'll play this game. And he retreats. And that's what happens overnight on the 24th, 25th, while Admiral Halsey is getting his head down, looking forward to launching first thing in the morning and destroying those carriers.
Well, let's talk about that, because on the 25th of October, John, you then have the battle off Cape Engano. So tell us about that.
Right. So Kurita does, in fact, turn his force back around and goes back through the San Bernardino Strait and then comes down to the south along the coast of Samar towards the landing beaches. And lo and behold, on the morning of the 25th, those little escort carrier groups that we were talking about, the Taffies, Taffy's 1, 2, and 3, and each one of them's got 6 of these little Jeep carriers, we call them. They got about 30 planes on them. One of their reconnaissance flights, is going off in the morning, just after coffee and whatnot, and goes over the northern horizon, and oh my God, here's this enormous force coming down on us. And the initial banter back and forth between this recon flight and the Admiral in charge of Taffy 3, a guy named Sprague, the pilot says, I've just seen the biggest battleship I've ever seen in my life, and nobody believes this guy. And so Sprague tells him to turn around, and I want you to go back and confirm this thing. And by this time, of course, the ACAC is opening up on this American pilot, and he very explicitly says, I've just seen the biggest battleship I've ever seen in my life, and it is flying the rising sun. So it's clear he's looking at Yamato, most likely. In any case, this force comes lumbering over the horizon then, and the Japanese and the Americans are both surprised.
I think it's worth saying, we're talking about 4 battleships here. We're talking about 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. I mean, this is a substantial force. This is the force that Halsey has left behind while he's going north. So not just Yamato, but some pretty impressive firepower as well.
No, it's a really good point.
Nagato, Haruna, and Congo as well. So this is a big, burly force. The Americans have just got a bunch of little Jeep carriers to fight them with. The thing that gets sort of lost, what ends up happening next is the American destroyers and destroyer escorts that are shielding this Taffy charge the enemy. And that is sort of it's one of the braver, I guess I would say, American naval fights in history.
Some would say suicidal. I mean, it doesn't make sense in a way. You've got a choice. You can fight or flight. And a lot of people would go, well, flight would be the obvious thing, but they take the fight too then.
Absolutely. Well, that's what destroyers and destroyer escorts are supposed to do. You got to escort your heavies. And so they lay down smoke and they go off and start doing torpedo attacks. And as you might imagine, a number of them end up getting blown out of the water. But the thing that gets lost in all this is that these Taffies are actually really, really resilient in that, yes, they're slow, yes, they're small, but there are a lot of them. And between all 18 of these little carriers, they're mounting almost 400 aircraft. And about half of those get up in the air and start doing air attacks against Kurita. And in many cases, they may not even be properly armed, but just the sight of a torpedo plane coming in and making a run on me as the Japanese, I have no choice but to react to that and try to evasively maneuver away. Well, when I do that, I throw my fire control solution out the window for my main guns. And so you end up with this sort of running fight where the Japanese are trying to chase down these escort carriers that are desperately, running away at top speed, which ain't real high. The net result is that the Japanese are able to sink one of those Jeep carriers. They damage another couple. But by the end of this 2-hour engagement, Kurita is like, I think I'm up against American fleet carriers, and I'm feeling increasingly overwhelmed by the number of American aircraft that are attacking me. And at the end of the day, he sends a signal back to Toyota and says, I'm aborting my mission. And he turns around and he heads back north. And
he doesn't know where Halsey is. And of course, he's been awake for about 48 hours, John, having been in the water the previous day. Yeah. So his decision-making is not great.
There's endless speculation as to why he made that decision. But I think you're right, Chris, that the man was exhausted and he's just not making very good decisions, or he is making good decisions because he realizes if I press on, I'm going to get trapped in Leyte Gulf. My whole force is likely to be overwhelmed and destroyed, and I'm going to lose 15,000 sailors. Is that really worth it? And apparently, in his calculus, he decides, no, it is not, and he turns around and he leaves.
And he doesn't know where Halsey is, so he may think that Halsey's in his rear anyway. I mean, as it is, he loses 3 heavy cruisers getting back. So, it's a pretty dangerous environment. But you have to say, and I think we'll examine it later, what if he carried on? There are all sorts of what-ifs about that.
OK, and we do need to talk about the Battle of Cape Engano, because that kind of happens, kind of simultaneously to the Battle of Samar?
Yes, it does, because as you recall, what's happened, Halsey's gone north. He's planning for a dawn strike against these 7 Japanese carriers under Ozawa. And about 8 o'clock, Admiral Kinkaid starts sending out distress messages saying, I think we're being attacked by large numbers of battleships and heavy cruisers here. Help. And of course, he's not on the same radio networks as Halsey is. And Nimitz, back in Pearl Harbor, is actually reading these signals. And there are progressively more panic-stricken signals coming from Kinkaid saying, you know, we're actually in trouble here. Where are you? Yeah. Now, what had happened the night before is that Admiral Halsey had said, I'm going to form a task force called 34. And it consisted of one of the carrier groups, two of the carrier groups, and also some of the battleships. And the idea was that if he thought that Kurita was coming through the San Bernardino, he would form this group and they would deal with the threat. But it was only what we would call in the Navy an execute to follow. Yeah. I haven't actually executed it yet. Trouble is, Kinkaid and Nimitz both think that this task force exists and is guarding the San Bernardino Strait. So Kinkaid is a bit distressed that these Japanese battleships and cruisers have turned up in the middle of his party. And so progressively this happens. Now, Admiral Nimitz's overriding principle throughout the war was you never interfere with the tactical commander while there's a battle going on. But on this occasion, he's really worried because he's picking up all these messages from Kinkaid. Halsey, meanwhile, has launched strikes against these Japanese carriers to the north. And what Nimitz does, he sends a signal to Halsey. Now, the Americans, because they didn't want the Japanese to intercept their signals and recognize them as being important, they used to put padding on the beginning and end of each signal. So he sent a signal to Halsey, which basically said, Turkey trots to water, Romeo, Romeo, which means that's the start of the message. Where is Task Force 34? Romeo, Romeo, the world wonders. Now, when it arrived in Halsey's flagship, the guy who handled the communications took the front bit off, Turkey trots to water, but not the second bit. So the signal that Halsey read was, where is Task Force 34? The world wonders. With that, his chief of staff, Mick Carney, said he threw his cap onto the deck and for an hour could not be talked to in his cabin because he was so furious. Yeah. Meanwhile, this is the attacks on the Japanese forces off Cape Engano are still going on. He still can't be talked round to take his force south again at this point. Eventually, Mick Carney, his chief of staff, convinces him he's got to go. He then says, we've got to refuel the destroyers. And he spends 2.5 hours refueling his destroyers before they go back. He really doesn't want to go back. Admiral Metscher is left to finish off the carriers and the two hybrid battleship carriers that Ozawa's got. And he starts going south again and essentially arrives too late, because the Taffy 3 aircraft, the Taffy aircraft, Taffy 3 and the destroyers have done their bit, and Kurita has gone back through the San Bernardino, and he arrives pretty late. Some of his carrier aircraft get to attack the rear end of Kurita's force, but that's it. And Halsey, of course, has been found in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the debate is still on today about whether he was sucked into that or not. The Japanese fully intended to suck him into that. They achieved that.
And John, very briefly, just to round things off, I mean, I suppose at this point then the Battle of Leyte Gulf is won and the Philippines in due course are liberated.
Right, absolutely. It's going to be a two-phase operation. We're going to capture Leyte first. We're going to put land-based aircraft on that. And eventually then we're going to go up and invade Luzon, the main island where the capital, Manila, is located. That's going to happen in January of 1945. And eventually, yes, we'll still actually be fighting in northern Luzon, even at the end of the war. But the majority of Luzon will be liberated at the beginning of 1945.
Well, there we go. That is the real history of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, John Parshall, to start with you, I want to ask you a really big question. Do you think anything could have happened that would have meant the Japanese had a victory at Leyte Gulf?
I'm going to be the Debbie Downer here and say nope. In my opinion, the imbalance of forces here is so pronounced that the Americans are absolutely going to succeed in the invasion of Leyte. The only question is, what's the butcher's bill? Again, we come into this campaign with more fleet destroyers in our fleet than the Japanese had carrier aircraft. The land-based Japanese planes have been almost wiped off the map. So I just don't see any way that we are not going to get ashore. And the final bit to say about that is just one of sheer timing. The earliest that Kurita's force could have gotten down to those landing beaches is 5 days after the landing, because the Philippines are just so far away from Japan and from Singapore. So by the time Kurita could have gotten there, the bulk of those landing transports and whatnot are already gone. The ship has literally sailed. There are second echelon forces that are bringing in the next wave of troops and the next wave of logistics. But the bottom line is that the landing force itself is on Leyte and is sufficiently entrenched that I just don't think that the Japanese could have destroyed it.
But Chris, what if Kurita had realised that what he was facing off Samar was not kind of the might of the US fleet?
I think John's right. I mean, the momentum of the campaign had actually sort of shifted at that stage, and it was well underway. What they could have done is actually done quite a lot of shore bombardment. There's quite a lot of logistics on the beach, and certainly within range of the forces. The one thing that makes its appearance in Leyte Gulf, which if it had been used in huge numbers could have had significance, is the first entry into the Second World War of kamikazes.
Ah, interesting.
And indeed, one of the escort carriers, Saint-Lô, is sank by a kamikaze. The Princeton had already been bombed by one of the aircraft from Luzon. But you have two casualties with kamikazes here. We go on to Okinawa later. You're talking about 1,500 kamikaze attacks. 380 ships have been damaged, 38 get sunk. So if they'd have introduced the kamikaze aircraft earlier, you're increasing what John calls this butcher's bill quite significantly. And had the same tactics been employed here, has it been employed later at Okinawa, where they targeted the troop ships and they targeted the supply vessels rather than the warships, then you may have seen a very different landing, and obviously the bill for that would have been much greater.
That's really interesting. Bring you in on that, John. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think that's right. Although, as is with the manner of all things military, you have to evolve to these things. I mean, there's punch, counterpunch, punch, counterpunch. Yes, the Japanese started out at Leyte using just 24 kamikaze attacks, and they were very successful. They sank the Saint-Lô. And so they sort of double down and they start doing more of this kind of thing. We are going to respond with a tactic called the big blue blanket, where we're going to basically put our air envelope over, any airfield that we can get our hands on and try to suppress those kamikaze attacks. It's only then at Okinawa that they will respond with what they call kikasui, which are these massed raids of 150, 160, 200 kamikazes coming in at one time to kind of swamp our defenses. Chris is absolutely right. If they had, had the mental epiphany to say, okay, we're going all in on kamikazes right from the get-go, and we're going to use them in a massed fashion, that would have been a real that could have been a very bad morning for us, I guess I would say. And yes, the butcher's bill could have been expanded.
And presumably when we're talking about how the Battle of Leyte Gulf could have played out differently, we do have to address the fact the Americans, frankly, could have done a better job. Had the command structure been better, they could have made it far more straightforward, could they not?
James, I think, despite the command structure, this is all down to Bill Halsey's personality. I said earlier...
And his staff.
Yeah, and his staff as well. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And you look at the psychological profiling. One thing we haven't mentioned is that what used to happen at sea is the Third Fleet used to alternate with the Fifth Fleet. It was actually the same fleet, but the Fifth Fleet was commanded by Admiral Spruance, the victor of Midway, and Third Fleet was commanded by Halsey. And Admiral Nimitz's son, after the war, said, one thing I'll say about my father, whenever something was really important, he wanted Fifth Fleet with Spruance to do it. If he wanted something that needed a bit of aggression, and actually perhaps there wasn't too much risk in it by the end, he got Halsey to do it. And we've got to remember that Halsey has built up this reputation as Bull Halsey. And I think by this stage, Bill Halsey has been overtaken by this character, Bull Halsey, and he feels he has to live up to that reputation. And all this doesn't happen like this if Spruance is commanding the 5th Fleet instead of Halsey,
I think that's right,
the 3rd Fleet. This is totally personality driven. And remember, that's what the Japanese were counting on. They'd actually sussed out their man, and they got 3rd Fleet heading north away from the main action. And actually, if you think about it, it's a brilliant plan if it all comes together.
So, John, if you are the Japanese then, and you know that an invasion of the Philippines is coming, what should you do? I mean, you know, they've got a bad situation. How should they have played their hand?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One potentially less aggressive way to go about this is to say to yourself, okay, look, the Americans are going to get ashore in Leyte, and there's not a thing I can do about that. But I know eventually they're going to have to come to Luzon and land there because that's where the capital is. That's where MacArthur wants to get back to, right? So I'm going to hold my hand because Luzon is a heck of a lot closer to Japan. And the timing of that may be such that, okay, if the Americans come in and land at Lingayen Gulf, which is what they end up doing, I might be able to get my forces to Lingayen a lot sooner than I could get them to Leyte. So now instead of taking 5 days to get to Leyte, I might be able to get to Lingayen in maybe 3. That has the potential then to do a lot more harm to that second follow-up invasion force that'll be happening in January. But this is a very aggressive Navy, and yeah, I don't think they would end up playing that card. I think if you look at the overall battle plan, it is extremely desperate. And the only guy who actually does his job well is Ozawa. And it's ironic because after the battle, he was tempted to kill himself. And yet he was convinced by his own staff members that, what are you talking about? You actually did everything that the battle plan asked you to do, you did. You lured Halsey away, and that was great. It was down to the other heavy surface forces, and they didn't come through. So you're not the guy who should be, committing suicide here.
Chris, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that is absent here on the Japanese side is submarines. This is wonderful submarine operating area here, and we've seen how the American submarines totally disrupted the center force that came through under Kurita. And the Japanese submarines, they've got quite a few of them left at this stage, probably about 60 submarines. They should be in amongst all these islands here. I mean, the water conditions here are great for submarines. And here in the Sibuyan Sea and also down here by Leyte, it's perfect for submarines. So that would be my addition. I'd have submarines in there. And of course, you take up a huge amount of destroyer and light cruiser time if you're actually going out looking for submarines.
I wonder if the bigger what if in terms of how this could have played out is actually if they didn't go for the Philippines at all, and if they went with the plan to go for Formosa. So I tell you what, let's zoom out, let's look at our big map of the Pacific, and let's ask ourselves that question. Okay, we've got our big map of the Pacific Theatre in front of us again now. And let's pick up on that point I raised just a moment ago, which is what if they decided they're going to follow King's plan, they're going to go for Formosa, modern-day Taiwan, instead of the Philippines. So Formosa is here. Now, I understand the reasons you'd go for the Philippines, in part political. MacArthur had said, we'll be back. Obviously, it used to be a US territory until the Japanese took it. So I understand all that. But if you're purely looking at it from a military point of view, had they gone for Formosa, Chris, how would things have played out?
Geographically, this is pretty interesting because Taiwan sits on the end of a chain of about 600 islands, actually, that lead all the way down from Japan. And the Japanese have been in Taiwan for the best part of a century, and the population actually got on with them pretty well. It wasn't like the way the Japanese sort of behaved in other countries. It's heavily defended. We know from Taiwan today that actually it's quite difficult to land. Got quite a lot of troops there. They're close to mainland China, which they're occupying. So they're able to reinforce aircraft, but also troops from there. You've got the Philippines still in your flank if you're operating across here. So your lines of communications can be threatened by an imaginative enemy. You've still got your fleet intact because you haven't committed them to Shogo in the Philippines. And of course, you can support Taiwan and this whole area here from Japan itself. So this is quite a formidable obstacle to get into. And as John mentioned earlier, the Navy chiefs, particularly Nimitz and Spruance, were beginning to say, this is actually a bit more than we can handle here. And looking at the balance of forces, it's pretty risky. Also, if you get a defeat here, it's actually a lot more difficult to recover than it is back here.
So they were right, in your view, to go for the Philippines?
Yeah, whatever reasons they went for the Philippines, whether it was political or MacArthur's ego or whatever, it was the right choice. And of course, it was justified by the fact that it was successful afterwards.
John, do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that 100%. We don't really have good information on why King had such a sort of a pet project view about Formosa. But I think in the end, the correct decision was made. You don't want to go to Formosa. You want to do the Philippines first, and then you want to take Okinawa after that. Formosa really is sticking your neck out pretty far into the Western Pacific. And yeah, if things go pear-shaped, you could potentially have unreduced Japanese forces on both your south and northern flank. So yeah, I don't think that Formosa was a good idea either.
I think also, John, you're actually setting yourself up for the decisive battle that the Japanese were craving for the whole war. And if you're able to attrit, in the American expression, American forces, particularly the lines of communications they come across, you're setting yourself up nicely for exactly what the Japanese wanted anyway at the start of the war.
It's a really good point, because, of course, the Japanese military doctrine was about engaging the enemy in a decisive battle that never really happened. I mean, let's just play this out, though. Let's say King gets his way and they do the Formosa plan. Do they succeed in taking Formosa, but it just takes an age? I mean, what happens, John?
I think that'd be where my money lands. That given the state of American amphibious art at the end of 1944, we can get ashore pretty much any place we want to get ashore. And, we're certainly going to bring enough fast carrier support with us to make sure that we can extend an air envelope that will crush anything that the Japanese can put in the way of that. So, yeah, I think we get ashore, but the terrain in Taiwan is terrible if you're an offensive force. And yeah, I think, as you say, it takes an age to overcome these defenses, and really sort of retards the progress of the more important war, which is let's get close to Japan and get set up for an invasion there. Again, Formosa, to my mind, makes much less sense than grabbing Okinawa, which is within direct air-based range of southern Japan. That gives us that, sort of launching point to get into southern Japan, and from there we can, move up and eventually invade close to Tokyo.
And on top of that, of course, you've got MacArthur sulking in the South Pacific.
Yeah.
Because he hasn't got his way with the Philippines.
Well, let's touch on MacArthur, because this is really interesting. In terms of long-term consequences, had it not been the Philippines, what happens to MacArthur, both in terms of, kind of his legend, but also then career? I mean, talk us through that, Chris.
Well, there's a number of what ifs here, isn't there? I mean, if they go for Formosa, MacArthur's back in the South Pacific trying to work his way back up to the Philippines here. Of course, if Formosa's not a success, he's saying, I was right all along. And, we've got this election coming up in November, Mr. President. I might run politically against you on the back of that defeat. Now, the interesting thing is, and we've said it's pretty unlikely, it had gone wrong in the Philippines, and MacArthur is actually either killed or thrown off the beach. It's a major reputational hit for him. He's recovered from one before, of course, by having all his planes hit in the Philippines the day after Pearl Harbor. But, that would be very difficult to walk away from. But you're right. MacArthur then probably goes back and does what he has to do in the South Pacific, but he's just another general on the end of the Second World War. Is he then in command in Korea? I doubt it. So the man who does
or does he end up then taking over? Is he named as the head of the occupation for a defeated Japan? Hard to know. Which, honestly, I'm not a big fan of Douglas MacArthur, but I think you have to give him enormous credit for being an extremely far-sighted and beneficent administrator of post-war Japan. He gives them a very enlightened constitution. He saves the Japanese people from starving during the winter of 45-46 when they were teetering on the edge of catastrophe. And that's a real humanitarian gesture on his part. And so, as much as I don't like his generalship, I do think that having him in charge of post-war Japan was to everybody's good.
Yeah.
And so any sort of a counterfactual scenario that deprives us of the services of this man in post-war Japan, that's not good for anybody.
And John, just hypothetically, if we follow Chris's counterfactual there, and they've gone for Formosa, it hasn't worked, MacArthur's been able to go, look, I was right all along, you should have followed my plan, Roosevelt made the wrong choice, he went with King's plan, which was the wrong one. And let's say hypothetically, and this is a big what if, but let's say he decides, OK, I'm going to run against you in November, so you've got MacArthur as the Republican candidate, not Thomas Dewey. Does he do better than Dewey? Does he win even?
I don't know. I feel like at that point in the war, FDR's reputation as a winning president is pretty solid. And I just don't see the American people switching horses in the middle of a war and going with an upstart, even though, MacArthur had a tremendous cult of personality behind him, and he would have made millions as a Madison Avenue ad man. I give him, full marks from a PR perspective. I think he probably could have run a pretty good campaign, and he was super, super famous. But I just don't see him beating FDR. That's my take.
Yeah, interesting. So let's continue with this Formosa what if, because I think this is the most significant counterfactual when it comes to the Battle of Leyte Gulf. If that happens, and we've said that probably the Americans are going to capture it anyway because they just have such an advantage at this point of the Pacific War, but it's going to take an age. How long does it take? And does it, in your view, Chris, extend the war in the Pacific?
Well, I think there are a number of things. We've got to remember what the Japanese are thinking about at this stage. They're saying, we want to kill as many Americans as we can, and we want to get a negotiated peace that means we don't get occupied. Now, if we get a situation here with this honey trap of Formosa, it gives the Japanese an opportunity to say, look, we can increase the stakes here. And it becomes a real poker game as to whose will cracks first. Now, we know the Japanese are prepared to sacrifice 100 million people if they have to. How long are the Americans going to put up with this? And you can see from the newspapers at the time, people are saying, how long is this going to last? And you can see in some of the secret documents that are now available, they're saying, how long till the Manhattan Project's going to deliver? We really need this right now because we need to have a finite end to the war. So if it becomes a battle of wills here, you might end up in a situation where the Americans say, you know what? It's not worth us actually crushing Japan. We just need to blockade them, maybe. We just need to fight them to a standstill. And the Japanese say, look, OK, we get it. OK, how can we talk now?
So they maybe try and starve them out as opposed to dropping the bomb,
Well, I don't think
maybe?
they have to, because I think the Japanese would say, look, we want a negotiated peace now. There's a thing called the Potsdam Agreement. And actually, it sets the basis amongst the great powers for how Japan can surrender, partly with honour, partly not without honour. But the Japanese are saying at this stage, look, if there's war criminals on our side, we'll try them. We'll deal with that. Don't occupy us. There's a whole load of things that are being put out in response to these Potsdam statements. And at this stage of the war, the Japanese still believe they can actually, if they make it too difficult for the Americans, to negotiate a peace, which means they don't get occupied and they don't get totally crushed.
Do you go with that, John? Because surely the whole point of the Allies at this point was they wanted an unconditional surrender.
Absolutely. And if you look at, all of the major decision makers had all been through World War I, and they had seen what had happened when you didn't occupy a post-war Germany. Lo and behold, you have this mythology around the stab in the back gets promulgated. The Germans don't actually think they're defeated. And fast forward 20 years later, you have an even larger, more horrific world war as a result. So there is no way that any of the Allied decision makers are going to allow a post-war world where Japan is not occupied. Japan is going to be occupied and demilitarized, and there are going to be war crimes trials, and that's just non-negotiable. The question is, how do we get there? And to my mind, the more I've studied the latter parts of this war, speed is absolutely paramount because, of course, the Soviets are going to come into this war too. Now we're jumping ahead to August of 1945. The Soviets are going to come into this war. you could easily have a situation where if this war went on any further than August of 1945, that the Soviets would have ended up invading Hokkaido. And you might have had a post-war situation where you've got a North and South Japan, just like you had a North and South Korea that persists to this day. So anyway, getting back to Formosa, if Formosa takes an age, that is bad. The Japanese are playing for time. We need to keep this war rolling ahead as expeditiously as possible so that we can keep the pressure on the Japanese to deny them the time that they need to fortify Kyushu in southern Japan against an invasion. So, yeah, had we gone to Formosa, I think that's very bad for the long-term prognosis of this war, in that the war, I don't think, gets over nearly as quickly as it did historically.
That's really interesting. Chris Parry, final thought. I mean, we've kind of fixated, and I think rightly so, because then the big what if here is about what if you do Formosa, not the Philippines. Any final thoughts on what the long-term consequences might have been?
No, I'd say, I mean, you know, we know the history without being deterministic about it. At some stage, you were going to go to the Philippines, whether you came through the Central Pacific or came up from the South Pacific here. It sort of meets very well. You can cut Japan off from its raw materials and oil here. It makes sense. I think Admiral King, who is brilliant strategist, there's no question about that. It's one of those areas where somebody needs to push back on him and say, this is actually probably too far. And I think we need to take John's point. You know, these are huge distances. And we forget that if you go from Indochina down to even Rabaul here, it's huge. I mean, a real symptom of that is the number of aircraft the Japanese lost just flying them out to islands. They'd fly out to nowhere. Now,
great point.
Yeah, the Japanese lost nearly 40% of their aircraft actually just getting lost in the Pacific. They didn't get shot down by the Americans. So these distances actually play on your mind, and it affects people's strategy and the way they think about things. And remember, King's strategy up to that point had been really successful. So something came in here, and I think it's the exception that proves the rule about his brilliance.
Well, look, I think we can probably say that the big what if when it comes to the Battle of Leyte Gulf is not necessarily could the Japanese have won at Leyte Gulf itself, because really once you've gone for the Philippines, it was pretty inevitable that the Americans were going to win. The Japanese fleet was so severely diminished by this point. They barely had any carrier aircraft left to fight with. I think the bigger what if, as we've been discussing, is what if King got his way over MacArthur? What if they go for Formosa, modern-day Taiwan instead? Because that would have been a far harder mission for the Allies. And probably they would have captured it in the end again because of that advantage that the American fleet had at this point, but probably it would have taken much longer. So if it does take much longer, does that mean the entire war in the Pacific theatre is extended? Does that mean that by the time you get to August 1945 and the Soviets come into play, that actually they take Hokkaido, they take the north of Japan, and therefore you get a situation where post-war, Japan is split up into North and South Japan, a bit like happened in Korea after the war, and therefore potentially you still get a divided Japan to this day. Some of the personalities involved, what happens to MacArthur? If they've gone for the Formosa plan, there is a scenario in which MacArthur feels he was vindicated, that he's been proven right, that they should have gone for the Philippines after all. Does he then use that as the kind of basis to launch a presidential challenge to FDR in 1944? Unlikely, and even if he did, he probably loses, because you probably don't ditch a wartime president as the war is coming to a close, as American victory looks increasingly inevitable. But it's an interesting what if. But also, therefore, what happens post-war with MacArthur? Is he there looking after an occupied Japan into 1945 and 1946? What is his role in Korea? Some really interesting long-term consequences, all spreading from the Battle of Leyte Gulf. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to Jonathan Parshall and Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me. And we'll be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, Times Radio History on YouTube. And if you like this, why not subscribe to Times Radio's main channel, where you can catch me presenting Frontline, our interview series about the war in Ukraine and other global conflicts. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye. Cool.